Today, I would like to talk to you about the question, what is art? I don't think you can ask what is art without saying it in the most pretentious possible way. So I hope I achieved that goal at least. This is one of those questions that they ask in like your philosophy 101 class, and everyone groans because you're like, oh, I kind of know it when I see it. And I know it's not a toilet in the middle of a museum, but I also know that it is painting, but what is it art? Well, it's really hard to say. It's been something that vexes people. We know there's something called art in the world and that it does something to us. I've been talking about it a lot recently on this show, but when you start to get around to defining it in pure, neat philosophical terms, it can often elude you. And this is one of the things that our modern tastemakers have used to their advantage. They'll say, well, you can't prove that the urinal isn't art. And then they'll just put a urinal in a museum and be like, it is art, And this fuzziness around the edges of the definition has caused us to kind of throw up our hands and just say like, well, anything can be art really if you choose that, if it's your interpretation, right? These things are subjective in the sense that they involve personal experience. They involve people perceiving them and have subjects who look at things like art or experience them in other ways. But they are not arbitrary. We have lost this distinction in our culture between subjective and arbitrary. The beauty of a sunset is subjective. There's just atoms and photons bouncing off of one another in a sunset. There's no such thing as color except in human perception. The quality of color is something that we just perceive, and perhaps God also perceives. But that doesn't mean that it's arbitrary. If I say the sunset is green when it's actually red, I can be wrong. I'm just wrongly describing a subjective experience. Now, art is kind of like that. It does involve questions of taste, and sometimes it can be hard to draw the line, like we've talked before on Locals about whether video games are art. I think they are. But really, this question, what is art, is urgently at the center of the stuff that we've been talking about just recently. Republic 3, I talked all about the role of art in society, what it does to us. And I said back then that Plato kind of lays the groundwork in Republic Book 3 for one of the most profound ways of looking at art and answering this question. So since I said that, I want to take that forward this week by reading with you a work by Plato's best student, Aristotle, who did kind of pick up on what Plato was saying about what art is in Republic 3, made some changes to it, disagreed with him in some places, but also carried his observations forward. This is the Poetics by Aristotle. I've cited it a million times. I think it contains the best definition of art to date, despite the fact that Aristotle was writing in the 4th century BC. I still think he got it, just about right. And I've mentioned it. I've talked around it. It's been a theme as we've developed these ideas on this podcast over many episodes, but we've never really looked directly at the Poetics. So we're going to fix that today and talk about what it is that Aristotle is saying about art and its role in society. If you want clean, no-nonsense basics, there's no better place to go than Public Goods. My whole house, which is now basically done, or at least it's ready for our housewarming party, is proudly displaying our Public Goods dish soaps, the delicious chocolate-covered almonds that are in our pantry, all kinds of stuff that we get from Public Goods because you just know that there's no gross, weird chemical additives. And they look great. They really add to any decor. And I should know, because I've been doing a lot of home decor lately, the Public Goods really does look good. They complement your kitchen. And like I say, there's no fancy chemicals that you can't pronounce. I'm a health nut, so that's really important to me, actually. And Public Goods is the place to go for all of this stuff. In addition, if you have a cat like I do, Chad Cat, he's painted behind me, then you have to feed him the freeze-dried duck nibs just so that you can say, freeze-dried duck nibs. All right, I love all of this stuff, and there's tons more, toilet paper, coffee, whatever, at Public Goods. We've worked out this incredible deal with them, which is $15 for free, no minimum purchase, when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. That's $15 worth of free stuff when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. So like I said, one of the best things about doing this show and hearing from you about what you're interested in and what you have more questions about, one of the best things is that we get to develop themes together and revisit ideas. And I want to emphasize that at the outset because it speaks to something important about reading and the life of the mind. You guys often ask me, like, I can't finish this one book. I know it's supposed to be important and famous, but it's just boring to me or whatever. These things don't just go in a line. They're not linear. You're not like, okay, well, at first I have to read Plato and then I read Aristotle and then I blah, blah, like a syllabus. It can be helpful to take classes where you do that sort of thing or to embark on those programs on your own. But the life of the mind is actually more circular. It's kind of iterative. It's like you'll read something once, maybe it lands with you a little bit, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you hear somebody mention something and you're like, oh, that kind of makes sense. And then you return to them again and again, right? And that's part of what we're doing on this show as we build up our bank of episodes, as I tell you about, Gawain and medieval poetry and then, ancient epic and, modern T.S. Eliot, modern lyric poems by T.S. Eliot, right? We're kind of creating this web of great works of the West and seeing how they relate to one another, how they draw on each other. And the reason we don't just go chronologically in order is, first of all, it would take forever. But second of all, we're kind of building a little universe of thought here, where we can connect things in a little bit freer way and come back to things. So one of the things we keep coming back to is this idea of mimesis. It's a Greek word. It means something like imitation in its core form. There's a verb form, mimeomai, I imitate, and mimesthai is the infinitive, to imitate. But mimesis is the noun, and the noun gets picked up in Republic 3 and then in the Poetics by Aristotle as this core essential thing to what art is. It's kind of like the basic primal instinct out of which art grows, according to Aristotle. And again, he's sort of observing here, he's thinking about what Plato said in the Republic, which, remember from last week, Plato said that, one of the things that we do when we recite poetry, when we compose poetry, when we act on stage, is we kind of mimic people. We mimic, say, Oedipus, the king, right? I'm playing that character on stage. I'm mimicking him. And it's not a kind of mimicry that just kind of leaves us unfazed. Well, the whole point of art is that it gets deep into our emotions. So Aristotle is saying, why is it that mimicry gets so deep into our emotions? That when I play Oedipus, I scream, I cry, maybe I really start to feel things, and you start to feel things too, right? There are these mirror qualities to what we do, right? You kind of mirror back at me what I'm imitating. And I, again, am mirroring or imitating some reality out in the world. What it would be like to murder your father without knowing it. What it would be like to discover that your children are incestuous children, right? Children of incest. So Aristotle begins there. He starts in his very methodical way at the very beginning and talks about this primal impulse. Now, we should say that the Poetics is about the Greek art of poietike, which we now translate as poetics, but which has, it really just means making, stuff that you make, crafts that you put together. You can make a table. You can poieo, I make a table. But poietike in its specific artistic sense has to do with a certain kind of construction, verbal and musical construction. So sung poems, just melodies, and of course, rhythmic speech and poetry. Aristotle, unfortunately, only left us his work on tragedy specifically. So some of his comments here are specific to tragedy, but he begins with a larger question about, well, what is this thing that we do when we speak in rhythm or when we sing songs, right? Epic, what is Homer, right? And so here's, from very near the beginning, Aristotle is measured in Becker pages. These pages refer to the sort of early printed editions, and this is Becker page 1447 A. I'm reading Anthony Kenny's Oxford World Classics edition. Nice clean copy that also includes some later works, especially from the Renaissance, that depended on Aristotle's Poetics. So it kind of traces the lineage of this idea. Like I said, this is one of the most powerful and long-lasting ideas about art in the West. Here's Aristotle. Epic poetry and tragedy, as well as comedy and dithyramb, and most music for flute and lyre are all, taken as a whole, forms of representation. That's translating that word mimesis, right? They differ from each other in three ways, either in respect of the medium, the object, or the mode of their representation. People represent and portray objects by using colors and shapes to make visible images of them. Some do this by skill, and others by practice. Others, again, make use of the voice. In like manner, all the literary genres mentioned make use of rhythm, language, and melody, whether separately or in combination. Music for flute and lyre and other instruments with similar effects, such as pipes, make use of melody and rhythm only. Dancers make use of rhythm alone. It is by rhythm expressed in bodily movement that they mime character, emotion, and action. There is an art that uses language unaccompanied, whether prose or verse, sometimes in a single meter and sometimes in combination. This, so far, remains unnamed. Now, this is a kind of, Aristotle, like I said, very methodical, much more methodical than Plato, right? The works that we have from him are not dialogues, although he did write dialogues, but we don't have them. Instead, we have these kind of notes and treatises, taxonomy of art, right? And remember that the word art is not a word that Aristotle really has in his Greek lexicon, at least not as we use it. In some sense, he's identifying this kind of mimesis, this sort of imitation or representation, as to be what eventually will be what we call art. He's saying there are all different ways that people make mimesis, they do imitation. They do it with color when they make visual art, when they paint or sculpt. They do it with sound when they sing, right? And then he's saying in that category, right, there is a kind of mimesis that is made in the medium of logos, rhythmos, and harmonia. So logos is like communication of ideas, speech especially, and then rhythmos is rhythm, and harmonia is the sort of, the melody and the way that the tones and the pitches are related to one another. And so in this broad category of mimesis, which in some sense is kind of what we would think of as like art full stop, Aristotle is identifying that one way that these things can differ is according to their their medium, right? The thing that we do them with. What do we use to convey something? Do I use sticks and scratch a picture of it in the earth? Do I use sounds and tell it to you? Do I use melody and sing, right? All of these options are available to us, but why? Why are we doing it at all? This is the next question that Aristotle sets out to answer, and he makes a brilliant observation. He says, two things, both of them natural, seem likely to have been the causes of the origin of poetry. Representation comes naturally to human beings from childhood, and so does the universal pleasure in representations. Indeed, this marks off humans from other animals. Man is prone to representation beyond all others. He is the most mimetic animal. He learns his earliest lessons through representation. A common phenomenon is evidence of this. Even when things are painful to look upon, corpses, for instance, or the shapes of the most revolting animals, we take pleasure in viewing highly realistic images of them. The further explanation of this is that learning is delightful not only to philosophers, but to ordinary people as well, even though they have less capacity for it. That is why people like seeing images, because as they look at them, they understand and work out what each item is. For example, this is so-and-so. Whereas if one is unacquainted with the subject, one's pleasure will not be in the representation, but in the technique or the color or some other element. So he's saying there are two primal instincts that we have that are generating our capacity for art, that are in their most refined form. These primal instincts eventually make mimesis of the kind that we now in English call art. One of them is this impulse to imitate. And he says we do this to learn as kids. Think about in school, right? Preschool. You walk into a preschool, any preschool, what are they going to be doing? They'll be singing songs and doing call and response, right? Acting out things, learning about things by, repeating them over and over again. We have this weird impulse to repeat things as a way of learning them. Repetition is the mother of knowledge. at a neurological level, it seems that we actually are structured this way. We have these things called mirror neurons, and we reproduce, for example, when mothers smile at babies, right? Babies eventually learn to smile back, and this is a mode of humanization that is essentially relational, right? And Aristotle. Now I'm sort of riffing on Aristotle here a little bit, but this is what Aristotle is observing, that at our very core, we look at one another and we do the things that other people do. And this is not necessarily morally good or morally bad. It's just how we function. It's what we are. A Christian would say, I would say, that this is indicative of our dependence upon God, that we are not the root and ground of our own being, but we look upward or outward to some higher authority, and then we gain from that what it is we're supposed to be. This is the purpose of Jesus, is to point us upward. Perhaps the purpose of Jesus is kind of an arrogant way of saying this, but this is one of the roles that Jesus plays in his life on earth, is pointing us upward to God, who is supposed to be the grand object of our imitation. But we do this all the time. We do it as little babies, we do it as kids, and it is our way of conveying things to one another. We can't convey things in pure material terms, at least not the most important things. I can't tell you, X milligrams of, serotonin flooded into my veins, right? I can say that to you, and you might know what serotonin does, but in order to really tell you what that is like, I can't tell you anything about my physical life. I have to say, oh, it felt like my stomach dropped into my into my feet. This is something that, we say all the time. We speak this way because it's a kind of proto-artistic way of conveying to each other the things that go beyond mere physical facts, that go beyond matter. Everything that matters, everything that's important is like this. Memory, dreams, desire, virtue, right? All of these things live in a plane of reality, at a level of reality that you can't capture just by saying facts and figures. And so we imitate, we create these reproductions of things. And then, says Aristotle, we also want to know. And this is why we want to know even about ugly and bad things, right? And this is going to be, I think, at the core of his divergence from at least the Socrates of Republic 3. He's saying, even if things are ugly, even if things are bad, if they're real, if they're true, we want to know about them. We're riveted even by, you might say, horror movies, for example, would be a modern version of this, right? That when we see a dead body, we want to see it. Aristotle, in some sense, is referring back to something that I will now scoop in advance, because it's from Republic Book 4, which we haven't gotten to yet, right? But in Republic Book 4, there's the story of Leontius, who's walking past these corpses, and he isn't sure whether he wants to see them or does, but eventually he just has to look at them, right? Aristotle's saying that is in effect also in things like tragedy, where we see the horrors of the universe laid bare before us. And because we recognize truth in them, because they are true mimesis, we are riveted by them. We kind of are, we can't look away. We want to acknowledge the truth. And this is why Aristotle's political program for art, which we'll get to in a bit, is not going to be Plato's political program of purely slicing off only the good stuff. Aristotle is going to say, no, art has a role to play in showing us the whole of human life, and that is natural to us. There's nothing we can do to get away from our desire to see and experience the fullness of our own humanity. You guys, I am so excited about our new sponsors, Omaha Steaks. I tell you, cometh the season, cometh the sponsor. It is bulking season, it is holiday season, and here is Omaha Steaks to the rescue with the highest quality meat you could possibly wish for the season. I love these guys. They have sent me a fantastic package of steaks and chicken breasts to grill, and you can be yours for the lowest price they have ever offered it for. If you go to omahasteaks.com and you enter heretics into the search bar, so search for heretics at omahasteaks.com, you will get the perfect gift package for $99.99. That's $100 for an enormous box of fantastic high quality meat, the world famous bacon wrapped filet mignons, which are steak wrapped in bacon, plus chicken breasts, sides, desserts, anything you could ask for. It's perfect for the holiday season, great to give as a gift or just to consume yourself. Go to omahasteaks.com, enter heretics in the search bar, And when you use the offer code Heretics at checkout, you will also get an additional 8 Omaha Steaks burgers for free with your order. This stuff is so good. I eat it all the time, especially during bulking season. omahasteaks.com, keyword Heretics, and use the offer code Heretics at checkout. So I mentioned that this is a way of thinking about art that has been profoundly influential throughout the whole history of the West. And I've read to you already some sources that would show that. Like I read to you once from Philip Sidney's Defense of Poesy. That's also in this Oxford World Classics edition. If you're interested, we will do episodes on just this Renaissance theory of art and the way that Aristotle got used by, for example, French neoclassicists. But I did want to read to you from a later source. This is G.K. Chesterton, the great 20th century Christian apologist. He's kind of often classed with people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien as kind of a whimsical British defender of the faith. And his writings are wonderful to read, incredibly glib and funny, but also in many cases very profound. So here's a passage from Everlasting Man, one of his biggest books, 1925. It comes out. It's an account basically of all human life. And this is on purpose because it's a sort of an anthropology of what Christ does, what man is and what Christ does. And in this, Chesterton says something quite similar to Aristotle. He says, art is the signature of man. And remember that Aristotle said man is the most mimetic, the most imitative of animals. And the way that Chesterton proves this or talks about it is by saying that when man first comes into being, no matter what evolution you may imagine that happened before that, there is this suddenly the impulse to make art. He says cave paintings are basically the first evidence that we have that something called a human being exists. And cave paintings were, coming to light newly in the beginning of the 20th century that Chesterton was reflecting on, and he was pointing out something about them that all the scientists who were looking at them and the archaeologists didn't really have a way of describing, and that is that they are works of artistic production. Here's a beautiful paragraph that kind of speaks to what Aristotle was just saying about our impulse to imitate. He's talking about a priest and a boy who have discovered a cave painting. The moral is something large and simple, so large and simple that when it is first stated, it will sound childish. And indeed, it is in the highest sense childish. And that is why I have in this apologue, in some sense, seen it through the eyes of a child. It is the biggest of all the facts really facing the boy in the cavern, that is the young boy who goes to find these cave paintings. It is perhaps too big to be seen. If the boy was one of the flock of the priest, it may be presumed that he had been trained in a certain quality of common sense, that common sense that often comes to us in the form of tradition. In that case, he would simply recognize the primitive man's work as the work of a man, interesting, but in no way incredible in being primitive. He would see what was there to see, and he would not be tempted into seeing what was not there by any evolutionary excitement or fashionable speculation. If he had heard of such things, he would admit, of course, that the speculations might be true and were not incompatible with the facts that were true. The artist may have had another side to his character, besides that which he has alone left on record in his works of art. The primitive man may have taken a pleasure in beating women as well as in drawing animals. All we can say is that the drawings record the one, but not the other. It may be true that when the caveman's finished jumping on his mother or his wife, as the case may be, he loves to hear the little brook a-gurgling and also to watch the deer as they come down to drink at the brook. These things are not impossible, but they are irrelevant. The common sense of the child could confine itself to learning from the facts what the facts have to teach, and the pictures in the cave are very nearly all the facts there are. So far as that evidence goes, the child would be justified in assuming that the man had represented animals with rock and red ochre for the same reason as he himself was in the habit of trying to represent animals with charcoal and red chalk. The man had drawn a stag just as the child had drawn a horse, because it was fun. The man had drawn a stag with his head turned, as the child had drawn a pig with his eyes shut, because it was difficult. The child and the man, being both human, would be united by the brotherhood of men, and the brotherhood of men is even nobler when it bridges the abyss of ages than when it bridges only the chasm of class. But anyhow, he would see no evidence of the caveman of crude evolutionism, because there is none to be seen. If somebody told him that the pictures had all been drawn by St. Francis of Assisi out of pure and saintly love of animals, there would be nothing in the cave to contradict it. This is a magnificent observation on Chesterton's part that goes right back to Aristotle's theory of kind of primal mimesis, imitation as one of the basic impulses. He's saying, sure, maybe, cavemen were next to apes in some way. Maybe they, had to hunt for their food in ways that were not much different from the ways of the apes. But they are radically different and completely cut off from apes in this way, which is that they have this mimetic impulse, this impulse purely out of the joy of things, out of the superfluity of their mind, and out of the fact that their mind is something bigger than just matter, to create artistic depictions, not just of this is what a stag looks like, but this is how a stag acts. This is, in some sense, even how a stag makes you feel when you see it. Those things that you can only convey through art. Aristotle tells a story, and there has been debate among scholars as to how accurate this story is historically. And I don't really want to get into that. I think Aristotle probably didn't have a ton of information about what he was talking about. But the story that he's telling is based on his idea about art. And it's the story of how tragedy came to be. He sort of suggests that originally what people were doing was spontaneously singing hymns, singing in reverence for the god Dionysus, the god of chaos, the god of wine, the god of frenzy, right? And that eventually over time, this was developed and refined. Now, again, the point here is not whether historically that is how tragedy came into being. The point is that Aristotle is observing in tragedy a highly refined and stylized form of what the caveman does in the caves and what children do in schools. That is, imitate to convey. And he's saying, it started out as just a chorus, and then one actor stepped forward, and then there were two actors, and finally three actors on stage, speaking the lines, right? And we've talked about this in tragedy before. It's not really something that we need to get too deeply into here. But the point of it, right, is that actually it's a fairly plausible description given what we know about things like opera, right? That we kind of move in Western music, modern Western music, from, plain chant to choral song and then on into kind of cantatas and operas, right? There emerges the kind of individual on stage depicting his individual experience with the backdrop of the kind of choral song that's been going on. What are they there to depict? That's the next question, right? What is the object of their imitation? Aristotle says the object of imitation is men in action, human beings doing the kinds of things they do. And so I'm going to read to you now a portion in which he talks about why tragedy represents things the way that it does. And I think we can roughly kind of expand this out to be all art. I'm on now to Becker page 1451a. From what has been said, it is clear that the poet's job is not relating what actually happened, but rather the kind of thing that would happen. That is to say, what is possible in terms of probability and necessity. The Greek concept of to eikos is important here, the likely or the appropriate. The difference between a historian and a poet is not a matter of using verse or prose. You might put the works of Herodotus into verse, and it would be a history in verse no less than in prose. The difference is that the one relates what actually happened, the other the kinds of events that would happen. For this reason, poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history. Poetry utters universal truths, history particular statements. The universal truths concern what benefits a person of a certain kind to say or do in accordance with probability and necessity, and that is the aim of poetry, even if it makes use of proper names. A particular statement tells us what, for example, Alcibiades did or what happened to him. In the case of comedy, this is already manifest. The poets make up the story on the basis of probability and then attach names to the characters at random. They do not write about particular individuals as the lampoonists used to do. In the case of tragedy, they retain the traditional names. The reason for this is that what is possible is credible. in a very, very distant way, Aristotle is kind of inventing here our concept of plausibility. When you see somebody on screen in a movie do something and you're like, he would never do that. And then you see somebody else and you're like, yeah, I totally believe that he would act that way. That kind of, oh, that's classic Homer Simpson, right? That's classic Homer. And then we all know somebody like Homer, who, just should go to the gym, but he just stays on the couch and, eats donuts, right? This idea of plausibility, which we use all the time in art, is not actually the idea of facts. It's not the idea that like, oh, somebody, it may be the case that somebody did something that is so amazing that it wouldn't be plausible in art. I mean, all the time now when we look at our politics, we say like, you couldn't possibly make this up. But it turns out that the New York Times is now defending a rapist. This is true. The New York Times is now defending a rapist because it goes with their political beliefs. If you wrote a story, it would be too extravagant to believe. Why? Because it's not the plausible that dictates reality. It's just what actually happens. And in reality, you have accidents, you have things that happen unexpectedly, things that come in, out of left field. But Aristotle believes that tragedians, dramatists, are in the business of representing to you a whole and complete set of events that follow logically from one another and that are governed by, at least in part, the characters of the people involved. So when we look at a movie and we say, oh, that's that's not the kind of thing that person would do, or that's totally plausible, we're using these same criteria. And he's saying this is actually more philosophical. It's like when chemists refine a certain a certain element just to examine that element, right? Take all the helium out of a gas and get all the other kinds of gases away and just see the properties of helium. That's what Oedipus is like, right? If you strip away all the extraneous accidents of like real kings in real life, this is what a king who was in this situation would do, this type of person. That's what tragedy and, in larger sense, drama is there to represent, right? Men in action, what are people like? And that, says Aristotle, is why it has this powerful effect on our characters, right? Why it worms its way into our souls is because it's basically refined weapons grade human character, right? It's like the, kind of pure cocaine version of, anger or fear or love, right? It sort of shows us those things in their most stark way. And then because we have this imitative response, right, we kind of get into it and we're like, yeah, totally, like get him, or, oh no, don't go in the house or whatever. And I'm using these very basic examples because of course you can then extrapolate out from them into more sophisticated things like, when we all kind of, set our teeth on edge as we wonder what Anna Karenina is going to do next, right? Or these, incredibly just, expansive feelings of grief that we have for Alyosha and the brothers Karamazov or whatever, right? Poetry is philosophical in the sense that it reveals to us the essence of our motivations and our humanity. This is where this idea of completeness comes. And so here, the next thing I'm going to read to you is this passage about completeness, which has been much maligned in history because it has been, I think, sometimes misused to draw certain lines around what artists can and can't do. You'll see why in a second. If you're listening to my voice right now, you probably already know that the higher education system is broken. But what you might not know is that one of the best solutions to that problem out there is the Albertus Magnus Institute. These guys are fantastic. They teach about the true, the good, and the beautiful, just like we do on this show. You can become a Magnus Fellow in order to learn more and take this education deeper. All their courses in the fellowship are live, online, and interactive in their tradition of their namesake, Albert the Great. This is the guy who was known for writing a treatise, De Sumo Bono, on the highest good. And that is exactly what they teach about at the Albertus Magnus Institute. And you can check it out now and apply to become a Magnus Fellow at magnusinstitute.org/heretics. You have to use that link because when you use that link, you'll get a free gift when you apply. One more time, it's magnusinstitute.org/heretics. Discover why the Magnus Fellowship is the fastest growing liberal arts learning community in the world. They are ransoming the captives of a broken education system in the great tradition of their namesake, Albert the Great. Check it out, magnusinstitute.org/heretics. Be sure to use that link to get a free gift when you sign up for the free, live, online, and interactive Magnus Fellowship. Aristotle says, "You must call to mind what I have said several times. One should never build a tragedy with an epic structure. That is to say, one containing more than one story. Suppose one were to make the entire story of the Iliad into one play. Epic is long enough for every episode to appear on an appropriate scale, but in a drama, the result is very disappointing. There is evidence of this. Consider those who have treated the sack of Troy as a whole, like Euripides, rather than piecemeal, or the whole story of Niobe, rather than what Aeschylus did. These people's plays were either complete failures or fared badly in the competition. There was even a play of Agathon's, which was a flop simply because of this." So remember that Aristotle is, even though he's later than the classical period, he is a careful observer of Athenian culture during the 5th century BC, and he's got a lot to say about different plays that, were on stage. So I don't mean to disparage his knowledge of his subject when I say that I think probably he's in some sense also theorizing, that is, talking about the rules of how this stuff works. What people have taken him to mean, wrongly, I think, is that everything in a play has to happen during one day, and that it has to, unity of time, place, and action, that it has to happen in one place. You can't change the set or whatever. In reality, he's saying something much more profound than that, which is that events and human actions have a logic to them that internally coheres. And even if that logic is dictated by certain fantasy ideas, like, right, Harry Potter, right? Lots of things in Harry Potter that aren't real. But once you've set the rules of the game, of the story, and said, in this world, people have magic wands that they wave and they say words and this happens, right? Then you're still just dealing with human people acting in human ways in that context of what it would be like if they were in this situation. This is one reason why so much of our modern art fails, and why I can say that the urinal that you just put in a museum is not art. I'm referring here, by the way, to The Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, which was a big watershed moment in the history of what's called found art. Part of the turn toward abstraction, toward sort of subversion in art. Basically, we've been trying for a while to get out of Aristotle's rules for art. And they're not rules in the sense of like, you have to do this. They're just observations about what art is, why we do it, what it responds to, and our attempt to get away from this, our attempt to create art that doesn't depict plausible human actions, but instead kind of, just puts abstract blobs onto a page and, invites our response or whatever. It's part of our attempt to get away from human nature. It's part of our attempt to say, oh, well, we can be anywhere. We can upload our consciousness into the cloud. We don't have to be restrained to one place. We don't have to be restrained to one gender. Gender itself is not kind of the be all and end all of our being. We can, cut and paste and rearrange and choose different things on different days, right? All of that effort is part of the war against being a certain kind of thing. You can't not be that kind of thing if you're a human being. You're just born into certain constraints. We hate constraints. We want to break them. And one of the constraints we want to break is our impulse to tell stories that make sense, that depict the logic of action. Critics fume when things like Dune or Star Wars do so well at the box office, and then they're like crappy abstract art is like languishing in the museum with nobody to go see them. Why? Why is that happening? It's happening because their crappy abstract art is based on sort of their desires and theories about what human beings should be. And Dune and these old mythological stories are based on the reality of what we naturally aspire to and love and desire. We want to see stories of heroism because we want to know what people are like in those situations and how they find their way to be heroes. How is it that Gawain, being a human, being flawed, managed to make his way to the end of his quest? This is why when we talk about whether video games are art, I answer in the affirmative, because actually it's right around the time that art begins to kind of dither off into abstraction that video games start to step in and tell these hero legends again, right? Joseph Campbell famously in The Hero with a Thousand Faces talks about the monomyth, right? The story we can't stop telling. We tell it in a million different ways. The hero's journey, he's called out from his home, he has to face a giant mystical threat. He triumphs and then he comes back home and restores peace, right? That's one of the classic stories. Why? Because it answers in us our yearning, one of our fundamental needs for human connection, for heroism, for manly courage, right? Why is it that Homer is a great storyteller, right? Even if he's working in a medium that doesn't just tell one story, it's because all of the stories he presents in the Iliad, for example, are stories that resonate with our human impulse to seek and see the best in us and the entirety of what we are, including the worst, right? Remember that those two things aren't mutually contradictory. And this is what we're going to get into now is the morals of art, right? Because we've been talking about that a lot. People think that you either have two choices. One, you can depict nasty, ugly, gory stuff and depict everything and shove your face in everything bad and hypersexualized. You might call this the WAP theory, right? This is like, like lay it all bare. It's all human. You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals. That's on one side. And then they think the other option is to have like art that only shows the good, just like in Republic 3, right? Art that only shows whatever your vision is of the best kind of thing, the best kind of society. Only need art that shows people being good. What we don't realize is there is a third option, right? And that is to show everything that there is and tell stories about all kinds of things that happen, but include in those stories a moral framework. So Macbeth is a perfect example of this, right? Macbeth, a play that if it came out today, conservatives would be like, tut, tut, there's awful lot of violence in that play, right? You watch the way conservatives are talking now about Squid Game, this Korean show on Netflix, right? Tut, tut, there's an awful lot of violence. If Macbeth were written today, I guarantee that's how conservatives, not all conservatives, but some conservatives would react. It's very gory, it's very violent. But as I discussed when we talked about the play, right, Macbeth is a play that takes place firmly within a moral universe. And that's why the witches are there, right? That's what the witches are a mimesis of, these supernatural beings who lock Macbeth into his fate and this supernatural torment that he goes through, that even though he's gotten away with the murder, he turns into a monster and he's ultimately torn down and destroyed, right? That's real life art that depicts real things. Assassinations happen, murders happen, people are venal, they're ambitious, right? But it depicts it within a moral framework. That's that middle ground that we're going for that I was talking about before. And Aristotle introduces for us the way to think about this when he says this is a human impulse. It's something that we just do, and yet also it has a profound effect on our moral. So I'm going to read another passage here that pertains to this. By the way, there's lots of other stuff that we could talk about in the Poetics. He goes through a lengthy set of prescriptions for how tragedians specifically should construct their work. I'm less interested in that now when I'm talking about the core of the work, because I'm trying to draw out for you what the insight is that has really just blown people's minds ever since this was written. Okay. And he talks about different objections that people make to Homer. And he obviously has Plato in mind here, among other people, right? Objections that Homer is immoral, that he's implausible, that he has all these problems. And he's defending Homer. He's thinking about ways that you might respond to all of these objections to defend Homer's art. Here's a really important, very short passage. He says, to determine whether something said or done was good or bad, you have to look not only at the actual deeds or words, but also at the identity of the person saying or doing the thing, the person to whom he said or did it, plus the occasion, the means, and the motives. For example, whether it was to achieve a greater good or avert a greater evil. So he's talking here about how to respond to moral criticisms of great art. And he's saying the context matters. In the Bible, the devil speaks. He says evil things. He says profoundly evil things, right? In the Bible, there is war and violence and all sorts of things that we might feel very uncomfortable about. Aristotle says, as a critic, as an interpreter of art, you have to be equipped not just to say, oh, they said a curse word, curse words are bad, but say, who said the curse word and why and in what context? Because that gets you thinking on the level of the entire artistic product and the role that it might play as a whole in society, right? What might it do to see this person shot on screen? Is there use for it? Is it conveying something? And does the thing that it convey come along with moral reality? That's why WAP is crappy art, right? That's why Lil Nas X is Montero is crappy art. Very skilled, very talented, very technically gifted person, right? But he's depicting essentially a world in which the reins of morality are completely loosened, and it's perfectly fine and healthy to have like all sorts of promiscuous sex. That's not perfectly fine and healthy. It doesn't help you. It's in reality, it's not good, right? And so it's actually an artistic failure for things that are morally bad to be portrayed as if they had the effects that are morally good. Understand what I'm saying? I'm not saying it is artistic failure to portray morally bad things, but rather, right, to put them forward in such a way as if they had a different moral nature than they do. This is what Aristotle is so brilliant at drawing out. All of the rudiments for thinking about art in this way are there. And one of the ways that I know is that when Aristotle then turns to his Politics, which is basically his version of the Republic in some ways. I mean, not in the sense of constructing the perfect state, but in the sense of discussing what politics is, what it's for. He turns, and in the last book, book 8, to thinking about music, the role of music in society. Remember that Plato thought about this too. Socrates in the Republic talks about which kinds of music are allowed, which kinds of melodies do and don't encourage us. And we still talk about this when we say like, oh, rap has all these driving rhythms, right? These bumping tunes, they're kind of primal. And there's something true about this, right? That certain kinds of rhythms make us feel certain kinds of ways, encourage certain kinds of emotions, and discourage others. Unlike Socrates in Republic 3, however, Aristotle has a kind of expansive view of how different kinds of art can be incorporated into society. So that's the next thing I'm going to read to you is from Politics, book 8. So Politics, part of a kind of course of study, it seems, that Aristotle was working on in the Lyceum, begins with the Nicomachean Ethics, which we've done a full episode on about how to sort of shape yourself into a moral being who desires the good. Aristotle thinks that this is the prerequisite for participating in political life, because if you've shaped yourself or if you've been shaped into somebody who desires the good, then you are in turn equipped to help shape the regime, the way that your polis, your city-state is formed. That's the Politics. It's in some sense the sequel or the natural follow-on to the Nicomachean Ethics. At the end of it, we're talking about music because music has this role in education that we talked about last week. I'm on now to Becker page 1339b, book 8, chapter 5. What we must first seek to answer is whether music is to be placed in education or not, and what power it has of the three we raised questions about, whether education, play, or pastime. It is reasonable to arrange it under all of them. It evidently partakes in all, for play is for the sake of rest, and rest must necessarily be pleasant, as it is a sort of healing of the pain coming from exertions. And pastime, it is agreed, should involve not only the element of nobility, but also pleasure, for being happy derives from both of these. But all of us assert that music belongs among the most pleasant things, both by itself and with melody. Musaeus, at any rate, asserts that singing is the pleasantest thing for mortals. Hence, it is reasonable to expect it to be brought into social gatherings and pastimes as being capable of providing good cheer, so that on this account as well, one might conceive that younger persons should be educated in it. For those pleasures that are harmless are fitting not only with a view to the end, but also with a view to rest. And since it happens that human beings rarely attain the end, but frequently rest and make use of play not only for some purpose beyond, but also on account of the pleasure, it would be a useful thing to have them rest on occasion in the midst of the pleasures that derive from this. But it has happened to human beings that they make play an end. For the end, too, perhaps, involves a certain pleasure, though not any chance pleasure, and while seeking the former, they take the latter for it, on account of its having a certain similarity to the end of actions. For the end is choice-worthy not for the sake of anything that will be, and pleasures of this sort are not for the sake of anything that will be, but of things that have been, such as exertions and pain. One might plausibly conceive this to be the reason, then, for their seeking happiness through these pleasures, though as far as sharing in music is concerned, it is not only on this account, but also because music is useful with a view to rest. Now, Aristotle is developing here is kind of a series of ways that music, and I think probably also art, can be useful, right? It can, I've talked about this before, the kind of Ciceronian idea, the Latin idea, it can docere, movere, and delectare. It can teach, delight, and move us. Aristotle is saying there are certain uses of music that are simply pleasurable, like at parties, right? And it may be the case that if music is harmless, or if the kind of music we're indulging in is harmless, it has a role to play in our society. Not everybody can be on all the time, right? Rest exists and is fruitful for future work and all of these things. And so you see him kind of softening the principles of the Republic on the grounds that even though perhaps the highest use of art is to instruct, it doesn't only do those things. So now he talks further, and actually this is very near the end of the book. So he kind of, as we have it, at least it closes with much of this. He starts to talk about the use of different modes. He says, with a view to education, as was said, those of the tunes that relate to character are to be used and harmonies of this sort. The Dorian is of this sort, as we said before, and one should accept any other that is approved for us by those sharing in the pursuit of philosophy and in the education connected with music. The Socrates of the Republic is not correct in leaving the Phrygian alone in education together with Dorian, especially as he rejects the flute among the instruments. For Phrygian has the same power among the harmonies as the flute among the instruments. Both are characteristically frenzied and passionate. Poetry makes this clear, for all excitement and all motion of this sort belongs particularly to the flute among the instruments, while among the harmonies these things find what it is appropriate to them in Phrygian tunes. The dithyramb, for example, is held by agreement to be Phrygian. There are two aims, the possible and the appropriate. Individuals should undertake things possible and appropriate for them. These things, too, are defined by ages. It is not easy for those exhausted with age, for example, to sing the strained harmonies, but nature suggests the relaxed ones instead for persons of such an age. So Aristotle, ever the moderate, ever the seeker of the mean, is working out a system in which music can have different roles in different times and places. And crucially, this actually enables him to be more strict about morals for children in education, because he's not being an authoritarian about music and art overall. He's saying, yes, music has all these different roles. However, it has this incredibly fissile, this explosive power, especially for children who are developing and need to be taken care of in their development. They're impressionable, right? We can watch out. It's appropriate according to age to give people different things. The enormity of sanity here, right? Just how sane this is, comes out of long engagement with the extremes of Plato's Socrates in Republic 3. That's why I said to you, the point of Republic 3 is to present you with the starkest possible version of what he's talking about, which is utopia and art in the service of utopia. Aristotle has taken that, engaged with it, and tried to work out the moderate middle that I talked about last week. I do believe that this is also our project. And going forward, I know I have a lot of listeners who make art, who make poetry, who comment on and consume conservative art, right? This is one of our crucial tasks in our crisis going forward. If you think it's not important, you're not paying attention. This is something that the left has done for decades, is seize the culture by means of art. We are in the process of creating art that turned the tide back, and we're not going to do it just by being censors and moralists, right? We have to find this middle ground between what art does, all the many ways that it conveys our humanity, and how art moves and affects us, and the role that it plays in a good and just society. Every time I watch these episodes back, I am so happy about my portrait of Chad Cat, which is from Paint Your Life. This is an amazing service. They take a photograph of anything you love. It could be a person, could be a special memory, could be just really anything that you cherish. And you'll work one-on-one with an artist, a professional artist, to make a custom-made painted version of it, just like that portrait of Chad Cat behind me. They do such a wonderful job. I was amazed at how quickly they did it. You can get it in as little as 2 weeks. And if, like me, you are inevitably going to suffer from dude panic, which is the panic that all dudes have when they wake up like shortly before Christmas and they realize there are supply chain issues and they don't have any gifts. This is a great option. It's a beautiful, personalized gift that you can give for the holidays. Some terms apply. They're available at paintyourlife.com/terms. And if you don't like it, you can get your money back, but I think you're going to love it. The way to do this is to text Heretics, Heretics, to 64,000, and you will get 20% off and free shipping guaranteed. Text Heretics to 64,000 to get your custom-made painting of a special photograph or memory. All right. That's about enough on what is art. Let's take a mailbag question. So here's Falderall in the mailbag. We are enjoying the slow march through the classics, yet it seems to me reading is often paired with writing. Should all good readers naturally turn to writing, such as Marcus Aurelius and his Meditations, or journaling, as did Lewis Carroll and Mark Twain? Well, this is interesting. So I don't think that everybody who is a good reader needs to become like world-class writer. I think that writing is a kind of a craft unto itself. It takes an enormous amount of time, trial and error, shutting yourself away in rooms for a long time. If you have ideas of things that you want to write, by all means, you should pursue that. Bear in mind how long it takes, right? This is something that I try to stress to people when they say like, oh, I have an idea for a piece in one of your publications. Like, okay, that's great, but it is actually a craft, right? And if you're just picking up your keyboard or your pencil for the first time, it's going to take some rejection. It's going to take a lot of editing. It's going to take all of this stuff. So there's writing at a professional level, which I don't think that anybody needs to feel obligated to do. Then there's writing as a practice of the kind that you're describing, Falderall. And I do think that that is a really important practice, something that can kind of bring us back to virtues that we have been deprived of in the digital age, like reflection. If you're going to do that, I think you need to do it with a pen and paper or a pencil and paper. Get an actual physical journal, write by hand, because the point of this is not to produce polished, finished products that are going to get aired somewhere. The point of this is to shape your own thoughts in response to and dialogue with the people that you're reading. There's a famous adage that clear writing is clear thought. And this is, I think, very true. Do your best to express what you're thinking in the clearest, cleanest possible terms. Don't try to impress anybody. This will be another advantage of journaling privately, right? Don't write in order to use the biggest words you know. One thing you will discover as you engage in that is it's actually very difficult to express in plain terms what seems perfectly clear to you in your head. This is a wonderful discipline. You can do it for half an hour a day. Everybody has half an hour a day, I assume. I have half an hour a day, and I'm the busiest person I know. So this is possible. And it's a mental discipline. It will shape your mind better than Twitter will shape you. We've talked about how art shapes you. The medium in which you work also shapes you. And there's no escaping the fact that just Twitter in itself, even if you're saying brilliant things on it, right, is designed to stimulate certain impulses in you that are impulsive, that are highly emotional, and that aren't necessarily worked out in the most fully logical way. So get paper, write with a pen, and extend your thoughts, right? Give yourself time to reflect and reflect actively in writing. But don't think of that as something that you have to then turn into a finished product. You may find that this discipline makes you a writer and that you have things you want to write, at an 800 or 2,000 word level to submit places. But I would put that out of your mind for now, unless it's your profession, because as a profession, it is incredibly punishing and takes a long time to get really good at. But as a discipline of the kind that you're describing, it is incredibly useful and mentally stimulating. All right. Thanks, Falderall, for being a VIP and asking that question. One more time, it's youngheretics.com/locals. Use the offer code heretics for a 1-month free trial. I will see you there, I hope. If you liked this show, as always, you should check out the Claremont Institute. We are an institute for the recovery of the American idea. We publish the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind, both sterling publications, in my not-so-humble opinion. And you can donate to support our, I believe, important work at claremont.org/donate. Let us know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. That's it for me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that